So think about this. Before we had history as we know it, how did people explain the world? Well, they had myths. Before we started looking for human causes for big events, we looked to the gods. For centuries, the grand story of humanity was all about divine will and fate. But what happens when an event is so massive, so undeniably human, that those old explanations just don't feel like enough anymore?
This right here, this is the world of Homer. It's a world where the biggest human dramas you can imagine, like the Trojan War, are ultimately being puppeteered by the gods. In this kind of worldview, your destiny isn't really a product of your own choices. It's more like a script written by a higher power. The most important things that happen aren't explained by human actions, but by these huge supernatural forces.
So what happens when a conflict breaks out that isn't about a few heroes and meddling gods, but about entire civilizations, massive armies, and clashing political ambitions? Can that old way of thinking really explain a huge human-driven war? You know, that question created a major intellectual crisis, and the answer would completely change how we see ourselves forever.
Okay, to really get how massive this change was, we first have to understand the lens people were using to see their world. Before history, there was myth. And myth was this powerful, poetic, and frankly, sacred way of explaining literally everything, from why the seasons change to who wins a war.
This slide just lays out the contrast perfectly. Myth looks for causes and divine intervention, right? Its truth is all about moral lessons, poetic justice, passed down through these amazing epic songs. But a totally new idea was starting to bubble up, one that looked for human causes, that demanded actual facts and evidence and was recorded not as poetry but as a systematic investigation.
So what was the catalyst for this huge shift? Well, it was an event so big it basically shattered that old mythic lens. We're talking about a war on a scale the ancient world had never ever seen before. A real clash of civilizations that just cried out for a new kind of explanation.
Yeah, this was not some squabble between a few heroes being manipulated by the gods. It was a gigantic Persian Empire squaring off against a scrappy coalition of small Greek city-states. The sheer complexity of it, the politics, the logistics, the different cultures involved, it created this intellectual vacuum. The old answer, because Zeus willed it, just wasn't going to cut it anymore.
And this conflict didn't just pop up out of nowhere. As you can see on this timeline, the fuse was lit a long time before the explosion. For over 200 years, the whole region of Asia Minor was incredibly unstable. You had invasions, powerful cities falling. It was a real pressure cooker. The Ionian Revolt was the spark, for sure. But the Persian Wars, that was the world-changing inferno that needed someone to bear witness.
And right into this intellectual crisis steps a man who realized that a monumental human conflict like this needed a totally new, monumental method for understanding it.
This is our guy, Herodotus. And he wasn't just a storyteller. He was an investigator. He had this absolutely radical idea. Instead of looking up to the heavens for answers, why not ask people? Why not actually travel, see things for yourself, and piece together the very human story behind this massive war?
And this, right here, is the absolute key. The word Herodotus chose for his project was Historia. Now we translate that as history, but its root meaning is inquiry or investigation. That one-word choice signals a huge shift from just passively accepting tradition to actively going out and seeking knowledge.
So how did he actually do it? I mean, his method was revolutionary. First, he traveled. He became part anthropologist, part journalist, going everywhere from Egypt to Scythia to see things with his own eyes. Second, he interviewed people, collecting oral histories from all sorts of different cultures. He really valued human perspectives. Third, he analyzed the causes, trying to understand human motivations, pride, fear, ambition, focusing on human choice as the real driver of events. And finally, he wove it all together into a single, massive narrative. Not about gods, but about people.
But here's the thing. Herodotus's inquiry did more than just explain a war. In the process of figuring out why the Greeks fought, he actually ended up defining who they were. His work was instrumental in forging this powerful new Hellenic identity for all these different Greek city-states.
This was his central framework. He argued it wasn't just army versus army. It was a clash of fundamental values. On one side, you had the freedom-loving Greek city-states, with their ideal of autonomia, or self-rule. And on the other, you had the vast Persian Empire ruled by a single, all-powerful despot. This simple, powerful dichotomy gave the Greeks a shared sense of identity and purpose they'd never really had before.
And man, did this framing have a long shelf life. Centuries and centuries later, you have scholars like Edward Said pointing out that this idea of the Orient as this outsider that Europe defines itself against became a super persistent pattern in Western thought. Herodotus didn't just write the first history. You could argue he wrote the first chapter in the long story of West versus East.
So what is the long-term impact of looking at the world through this lens? I mean, how did this ancient framework, forged in the heat of a single war, end up shaping our world for thousands of years?
Well, what started with Herodotus' simple idea of liberty versus despotism, it grew over the centuries into this really powerful and, let's be honest, deeply problematic set of cultural stereotypes. The West started to see itself as rational, democratic, and progressive, while it defined the East as the total opposite, mystical, despotic, and unchanging. It's a simple binary, and it's a powerful one.
And the consequences were just immense. This us versus them narrative helped create the very idea of the West. You see it running through epic poems and famous plays. And, on a darker note, it provided a cultural justification for centuries of conflict and colonial expansion. It became, as Said put it, one of those structures inherited from the past, a lens we just kept using to view and organize the world.
So, where does this all leave us? Well, with a pretty complex legacy. Herodotus' invention was truly one of humanity's greatest intellectual leaps. But like any powerful tool, it's a double-edged sword.
And you can't deny the gift. It's profound. He gave us the power to be the agents in our own story, to look for causes not in the stars or with the gods, but in ourselves. He taught us that the past isn't some fixed myth. It's something to be investigated. It's an inquiry.
And that leads us to the final big question. The power of history is that it helps us build an identity, to understand who we are. But is it even possible to tell the story of us without creating a them? Herodotus kicked off this inquiry about 2,500 years ago, and frankly, it's an investigation that we're all still a part of today.